share my screen and present. Okay. Cool. So start off quickly by introducing myself. I'm Alice. I am a stylist focused on ethical fashion and the co-host of CommonThreads podcast. So what we do with CommonThreads is we want to help connect consumers to ethical fashion. There is a lot of jargon out there, a lot of greenwashing, and we try and cut through that to help people understand the issues. So I am not here to lecture at you. I am not here to tell you what you're wearing is wrong. I was the worst for fast fashion. I actually started out as a fashion blogger over 5 years ago, and I worked with big brands frequently like Boohoo, Shein, Pretty Little Thing. There's a picture here that shows a collaboration I did with Boohoo. And I felt so lucky to be gifted clothes from these popular companies. But the turning point for me was in December 2018. I had 5 flat moves in 2 years, and I just found myself despairing about the vast quantity of clothes I had owned and then discarded within that time. I'd spent so much money and I had nothing to show for it. I didn't have anything to wear either. So it took a lot of unlearning for me to recover from my fast fashion overconsumption, but if I can do it, I am confident everyone else can too. Oh, here we go. So when it comes to fashion and the climate, I think for a lot of people until quite recently, unless you were very deeply embedded with the whole sustainability movement, is what does fashion actually have to do with the climate crisis? But fashion's impact on the environment is undeniable and it is serious. The fashion industry is responsible for 10% of humanity's carbon emissions. That's more emissions than all international flights and maritime shipping combined. It's the second biggest polluter after oil. So if nothing changes, by 2050, the fashion industry will use up a quarter of the world's carbon budget. Now, I feel I've given myself a lot to cover in a short talk, so these are kind of the key points I'm going to be looking at. I'm going to be looking at overconsumption, the way clothes are made, who makes them and why it hurts them, and what we as consumers can do. So I think it's helpful to start off by looking at what is fast fashion. It's a term that gets shared a lot when we're talking about sustainability, but unless you are like a young person living your life on Instagram, it's not always clear what fast fashion is. So for me, fast fashion kind of stems back to mass-produced fashion in the 1950s and 60s. We have companies like Biba who were quite instrumental in this. For the first time, women could shop trends. They could wear things that their friends were wearing. They could go out and spend their pocket money on outfits. But back then, clothes were still made locally and it was relatively small scale. So the real tipping point was the early 2000s, partly due to changes in global trading quotas, and that opened the floodgates for imports from the Asian continent. And at that time is when fashion switched to the take, make, dispose model that we are living with now. So they take the world's resources, they make them into clothes, and they intend for us to then dispose of those clothes as quickly as possible, as value comes from creating as many products as possible. Now, Zara generally has a lot to answer for in terms of ethical fashion conversation, but they are very much considered to be the forefathers of this fast fashion model that we are living with now. So you can probably remember, I always think back to the early noughties, something like Next in the UK. Next Directory would come out and there would be like 2 clothing collections out a year. You had time to kind of save to buy those clothes. They'd be there for the 6 months and then they go on sale. But Zara decided to completely change up this model. So they decided to start producing 12,000 designs a year of limited runs. So the things would only stay in the shop for around 4 weeks and there'd be 2 new drops a week. So these clothes were designed to sell out rather than last until sale time. This created a buy now mentality and it also made customers return weekly. So it's very much what kickstarted. Nowadays, if you go on any clothing retailer's website, they'll have a new in section that's possibly updated weekly. Of course, it wasn't just Zara, there was lots of companies doing similar things. H&M streamlined its production process from design to shop floor in 3 weeks. So in slow fashion terms, that would take more like 12 months. And when we talk about fast fashion, I think people often think of Boohoo, Misguided, all these companies that have had really bad press over the past few years, but fast fashion is everywhere. I would say every single clothing company that you can buy on the British high street is fast fashion, and the cost of a garment doesn't necessarily prove that it's been made ethically or sustainably. So the things I would advise that you look out for is how much does the garment cost, although that isn't absolute. If it's very cheap, it can't be ethical. Is the style very trend led? So is this something you would want to wear in 12 months? If not, it's going to be fast fashion. What fabric is the garment made from, and is it quality manufacturing? And lastly, where was the garment made? Obviously, there are good factories in places like Bangladesh, but if it's ticking all those other boxes and it's made in a country that's known for labour abuses, then it's probably fast fashion. So one of the biggest issues with fast fashion, but it's something we as consumers can change, is overconsumption, and that's impact on the environment. So clothing production has roughly doubled since the year 2000, and current estimates put it between 80 to 100 billion garments produced each year. And each person in the UK buys an estimated 26.7 kilograms of clothing every year. And of that clothing, 350,000 tonnes end up in landfill. If my calculations are correct, that is equivalent to about 70,000 elephants. And it's not just the scale of what we are buying, but it's also what those things are made of. I think there's a lot of very well-meaning environmentalists out there who are trying to kind of cut back on their plastic usage without thinking about the fact polyester is a plastic. As much as 65% of our clothing is made from synthetic materials, which is mostly from polyester. About 70 million barrels of oil a year are used to make the polyester fibres in our clothes. But it's not just the issue of the fact we are taking fossil fuels and then the emissions of processing these fossil fuels, but it's also washing these clothes. Washing a synthetic garment releases 500,000 tonnes of microfibers into the ocean each year, which is the equivalent of 50 billion plastic bottles. We can fish out plastic bottles, but we can't really do the same for microfibers. And it's thought that 35% of all microplastics in the ocean came from washing our clothes. Now, polyester over the past year has got a really bad reputation, but natural fibres or semi-synthetic fibres have a lot to answer for too. For example, viscose is made from tree pulp, and 150 million trees are logged every year to be turned into this fabric. Dissolving the pulp is a very wasteful process. It wastes about 70% of the tree, and it's very chemical intensive. And it's not just the volume, but where we are getting this wood from. So a lot of it comes from endangered forests such as the Amazon. And finally, in the fabric front, we have cotton, which is the world's largest non-food crop. More than half of global cotton production takes place in areas with high or extreme water stress. So this is a picture of the Aral Sea, which was, the water was taken to irrigate cotton growing in Uzbekistan, and it has dried up the Aral Sea. We did that. So cotton, to make one cotton t-shirt takes 2,700 litres of water, and this is where the consumption and the environmental impact really meet. You know, if we're going somewhere like Primark, which is encouraging you to buy 5 t-shirts for £3 each, that's 5 times 2,700, and those 5 t-shirts are probably not even going to get worn. And that's not even looking at the human rights impact of something like cotton. We've got forced labour, cotton subsidies keeping prices impossibly low, and the impact of the toxic chemicals. So although this talk is more aimed at the environmental impact, for me it's impossible to talk about the environmental impact of fashion without also looking at who makes our clothes. So 1 in 6 of the world's workers are employed in the fashion industry, and around 80% of those workers are female. So it is a huge global industry that affects everyone. And the average pay of a Bangladeshi garment worker is $95 a month. So the main event that kind of brought the labour, the human rights issues into public attention was Rana Plaza in 2013. This was when a factory collapsed and over 1,000 people died. And clothing companies here in the UK were very quick to deny any involvement. It was only after labels were found in the rubble that we were able to connect them. And the reason this happens, there is a lot of subcontracting. So just because companies say they are ethical on their website doesn't mean a thing. The most recent focus on the human rights impact of fast fashion was over lockdown. This was the hashtag Pay Up campaign, which is when global brands refused to pay for $40 billion worth of finished goods. Millions of workers were laid off in those countries with no severance pay or their final wages paid. But we'll come back to that in a minute. So when we're talking about the human impact of fashion, that isn't always obvious as to how that relates to the environmental side, but I think it's really, really important that we don't forget that the people who make our clothes are the ones most impacted by the environmental effects. It's their rivers which are being polluted from dyeing clothing and tanning leather. It's their air that's full of toxic chemicals from burning textile waste. It's their landfills that are being filled up with our secondhand clothing. And us contributing to deforestation due to our insatiable thirst for cotton, viscose, and leather is going to impact countries in the global south much more than it impacts us. That's all very doom and gloom, but the good news is consumers want change. This is absolutely something I have observed through my own work, working with people to help match them up to ethical brands. Online searches for sustainable fashion tripled from 2016 to 2019. And I know that this year especially, I have seen people engage with the ethical fashion conversation like never before. People are waking up to what's going on and consumers want change. But education is key, which is why events like this are so amazing. But Fashion Revolution found that 94% of those they surveyed about their work said Fashion Revolution had had an impact on their approach to their wardrobes. For me, it's very much a genie out the bottle situation. Now that I know about the human impact and the environmental impact of fast fashion, it's impossible for me to go back. And the success of hashtag Pay Up shows that consumers are listening and they're interesting. 270,000 people signed the original petition. So if you are looking to adopt a more sustainable wardrobe, the biggest thing I would say is beware of greenwashing. This is when companies like H&M, who have a lot to answer for in this, Boohoo, Topshop, literally all of them at the moment, are producing capsule sustainable collections. And if you're not totally sure about what the term greenwashing means in terms of fashion, this is when brands focus attention on small improvements without changing their business model. So recently, ASOS, for example, announced they were going circular when they had, I think there was about 12 garments in their circular collection, and they produce hundreds of thousands of garments a year. So they are not circular. The point of greenwashing is it distracts from big issues by overstating the significance of certain elements. For example, recycled polyester mini collections. And the biggest issue with greenwashing for me is you can use all the organic cotton, all the recycled polyester in the world, but if your garment workers are not being paid a living wage to make those clothes, then you are not ethical or sustainable. So what can consumers do? Buy less and rewear. This is the biggest piece of advice I can give you. It's something that I work really hard with my clients to help them find the joy in their wardrobe again so they don't feel like they have to buy new. They're not succumbing to that advertising to find new ways to wear things. And just by extending the life of a garment 9 extra months reduces its environmental impact by 20 to 30%. Buying secondhand is an amazing way to still dress the way you want to while being kind to the environment. This is a photo of me dressed head to toe secondhand. Also wash your clothing as little as possible. It sounds gross, but it's absolutely not. Your clothes are not made to be they're not designed to be washed as much as we currently wash them, and it really minimizes your environmental impact. And if you do have the privilege to afford a bit more for your clothing, then support the smaller ethical brands. There are companies out there who are trying to completely change the way the fashion industry operates, and we should be investing in them. These are also some of the sustainable fabrics that you should look out for instead of things like viscose and polyester. But I want to finish by saying it's not on consumers. There is only so much that we can do. Government policy and the attitude of big fashion corporations has to change. A lot of people have never even heard of this, but in 2019, the Environmental Audit Committee created a report about how the government could introduce policy to fix fashion, and all of their suggestions were rejected. So there has been renewed interest in policy change. Just a couple of weeks ago, Hubbub created a report which showed that we as consumers want change. We're willing to pay a little bit more, and we're willing to support these companies if the government backs the initiatives. My problem with this is looking at ways to develop research, which is great, but this policy from 2019 was more about holding fashion companies accountable, and until they're being held accountable, the system is not going to change. Which brings me back to our garment worker, and I'm going to finish with a slightly controversial point and say that when it comes to fashion, climate change is the symptom, not the overarching problem. Until we are changing the way that we consume fashion, until we are changing the way capitalism leaves us with such great inequalities, until people are paid well for their clothing and then their lifestyle improves, then climate change is going to happen. So I hope that has been useful. It's quite a lot to touch on, so if you have any more questions, I'd love to hear from you. You can find out more about my work with sustainable fashion, my website styledbyalice.co.uk. You can follow me on Instagram, and my podcast is CommonThreads that you'll find on Spotify and iTunes. So yeah, that is everything from me, and I will pass you over to James.
Good afternoon, everybody. Good evening. Thank you very